Carolyn Levine is our Accessibility Services Coordinator here at Blue Ridge, and we're really excited to be able to learn more about working with students on the autism spectrum. Today's session is being recorded, and we do have an auto transcription available. If you want to read captions, you could just turn that on in the bottom menu of your Zoom call. We'll go ahead and get started. And if you have any questions, I think that Carolyn's very happy to field questions as we go. So feel free to let her know. But for now, you may want to mute your mic so that her voice picks up and is targeting the speaker view of the Zoom call. Carolyn, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. So again, I'm Carolyn Levine. I'm the Student Accessibility Services Coordinator. As I'm sure you have noticed, Disability Services did change its name, so we're now Student Accessibility Services. Yay! There is an official announcement coming out later this month, but we did want to make that change because we felt like it was more inclusive and better represented what this office does. And so we're hoping that will take some of the stigma away from students maybe resisting coming to get accommodations and not wanting to label themselves as having a disability. That can be tough sometimes. But yes, please ask questions. I get tired of hearing my own voice, so talk to me. All right, so I'm going to talk about the prevalence of autism spectrum disorders and how faculty can work with students that are on the spectrum. I did want to make a note that these strategies are not meant to substitute or replace any formal clinical treatment. So I don't ever want faculty or staff to feel like they are responsible for, you know, a student's behavior and being able to treat that or intervene in any kind of over the top or clinical way. Right, so prevalence of autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. I got this information from the CDC's website. They use developmental disabilities monitoring networks. So these are just small pockets of individuals in different parts of the country. So just keep that in mind. Take this with a grain of salt. This is an estimate. But in 2010, they estimated about 1.5% of children had an ASD diagnosis. And in 2020, that estimate went up to 2.8%, which is a pretty, significant increase. ASD is reported in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. However, it's more common in boys than among girls, 4 times more common actually. Some of that might have to do with just the way that it is diagnosed and the way that those symptoms manifest themselves. So a lot of times in boys, you see that more outwardly aggressive behavior, which of course is more noticeable to folks, and you're more likely to get a diagnosis when your behavior is interrupting class or interfering with the work or some other aspect of your life. Girls also tend to get diagnosed later than boys do for that same reason, pretty much. So this increase in the prevalence of ASD could be attributed to our understanding of ASD and the clinical definition that's been expanded quite a bit. And also there's a lot more programs out there designed for early diagnosis, early intervention, because there's a lot of data that shows that early intervention is very, very helpful for folks that have an ASD diagnosis. Have you noticed in your classes that you've had more students on the spectrum? Okay. Did they tell you that they were on the spectrum, or was it just kind of obvious?
They didn't tell me. It was just kind of obvious. I'm not an expert, but I strongly suspected.
Gotcha. You're probably correct then. So what is autism spectrum disorder? This is the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for ASD. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot of detail. I just want to go over the general, the big main points. So ASD is not an intellectual disability. Sometimes folks think that it is some kind of cognitive delay because it is classified as a developmental disability, but folks on the spectrum don't always have any kind of cognitive impairment. It really depends. It's a spectrum disorder, so that means you've got a very, very wide range of, high functioning when it comes to intellect, and then very low functioning and everything in between. But the main hallmarks of ASD are those persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction, so that especially that reciprocity, difficulty developing, maintaining relationships, picking up on nonverbal cues, lot of issues with empathy, understanding where other folks are coming from. You also see restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. So you might see stereotyped or repetitive movements. In more severe cases, you might see what's called a flapping, or like where they'll flap their hands, or you might see sometimes it's self-injurious behavior where they're banging their heads against the wall, or maybe they're hitting something. A lot of times you will see this fixated interest. So they're very, very interested in this one thing. I had a student years ago who was so into Power Rangers, and he found a way to work that into every single conversation. No matter what you were talking about, he found a way. And if you were trying to talk about anything else, good luck getting a lot of answers out of him. You also might see some sensitivities to sensory aspects of the environment. So things like lighting, temperature, even fabric. Sometimes you'll see folks on the spectrum who have that kind of sensitivity. They'll wear their clothes inside out, or they may not wash their clothes as frequently, especially if they have like a favorite sweatshirt or jacket. It's often or not unusual for those to go unwashed for quite a while because they like the way it feels, and once it's washed, it feels different, and that can be upsetting. Also, we see that these symptoms are present in early childhood. We might not see how they fully manifest until the person gets a little older. Some folks, depending on where they fall on the spectrum, may be able to cope a little bit better. They may have some strategies of their own they've been able to adapt. Some folks may not, but those symptoms cause clinical impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And of course, the disturbance is not better explained by an intellectual disability. But again, folks with ASD can have intellectual disabilities, but they don't always. And those intellectual disabilities can also vary quite a bit in severity. You also see a lot of comorbid diagnoses with ASD, especially with things like ADHD or anxiety. And a lot of times those symptoms look very similar. So it can be hard to differentiate at first. Any questions so far? So talking a little bit more about those common characteristics of ASD diagnoses. So the big one, that social communication and interactive behaviors, little or inconsistent eye contact. That's probably one that people know the most or is the most easily recognizable. This could also look like not responding or maybe being slower to respond to verbal instructions, displaying facial feature or expressions and gestures that don't really match what's being said. So maybe their tone of voice is very angry, but they're saying, I love this class, and their brows are furrowed. And you're like, do you love this class? Because you look really mad about it. Things like that. That having an unusual tone of voice, sometimes it can sound almost sing-songy, or it might sound flat and robot-like. So that really flat affect, not showing a lot of emotion on their face is very common for folks with ASD. Trouble understanding other people's point of view, why other people do the things that they do is very common, and difficulty adjusting behaviors to social situations. So in the K-12 setting, they do a lot of like social script, or I can't remember what they call it anymore, where they practice being in different social scenarios and what to say. And so you and I might walk into the office and it's just automatic that we say, hey, how are you? When we walk by someone's office. Someone on the spectrum may not necessarily think that, or someone may ask them how they were or how was your weekend, and they'll say, great, and then that's it. They won't automatically ask the other person, how was your weekend? Which is how most of us would respond, that back and forth. That can come off as very rude and unsettling to some people, even though that particular person who is on the spectrum isn't necessarily trying to be rude or dismissive. They just don't always think that way. They're like, okay, you asked me a question, I answered it, now we're moving on. So more about restrictive and repetitive behaviors. So this could be anything from verbal repetitive behaviors, so repeating certain words and phrases, being really fixated on certain topics, like my individual who was really into Power Rangers, maybe getting very focused on moving objects. So sometimes you're seeing younger children, they want to line up their toys a certain way, or they want to have their room arranged a certain way. Getting upset by changes in routine having trouble with transition, so moving from one task to another might take a little longer, might be a bit more difficult. And again, that sensory sensitivity, so things like lights, sound, clothing, temperature. For some folks, not all, but for some, that sensitivity can almost be painful. So like the buzzing of fluorescent lights, we may not notice it, but someone on the spectrum might, and they might be so sensitive that it's painful for them to be around that. Okay. So how does this look in higher education? So because we're in obviously a post-secondary institution, we aren't going to see as many of those severe ASD behaviors and symptoms. So we're not going to see so much of the aggressive acting out or self-injurious type behavior, stimming behavior. But we are going to see things like behaviors that may come off as rude, trouble staying on topic in class, they may interrupt a lot, or they like to say something irrelevant that has nothing to do with what you're talking about. They will be easily overwhelmed. They'll have trouble being flexible. If part of the course you say, okay, well, we're going to do this today, but we're actually going to do this instead. That's going to be hard for someone on the spectrum to switch gears like that. It's going to take a little while to adjust. Trouble understanding instructions. And I'm going to talk about this a little more later on, but especially verbal instructions can be really hard. So if you are able to provide instructions in writing, I would highly encourage you to do so and make them as detailed as possible. That delayed response time we talked about a little bit earlier. You might also see a lot of social immaturity, having trouble understanding jokes, sarcasm, irony. They might also seem like they're disengaged. Some folks will use like a fidget object of some kind, and it may look like they're really into that, but they're still listening. So as we go through all this, again, I don't want anyone to feel like they need to be diagnosing or, anything like that. I just hope that after seeing this and hearing this, maybe just give students a little bit more grace, not assume the worst. Just because maybe they're not quick to answer, or maybe they're very quiet and not looking you in the eye, doesn't mean that they're trying to be disrespectful. They might have something like an ASD diagnosis going on. So I am a visual person, and I like to include at least one visual in all of my presentations. I really like this one. This is called the tendril theory, and it's a visual about how hard it is to switch tasks for someone that is on the spectrum. And basically it just shows kind of how they feel like how it feels to be focused on something, and then what it's like to have to be interrupted and switch tasks abruptly. And it just kind of gives a little bit more insight into that needing more time to respond to things or to process instructions. So if you call on a student and they don't answer immediately, this might be part of it. They might just need a minute to regroup, reprocess, switch from one gear to the next. Any questions so far? All right, so communication strategies. I think these are really, really helpful, not just for folks on the spectrum, but for anyone in your class. But especially for folks on the spectrum, using direct language is a must. So you want to try to avoid irony, sarcasm, things like that, especially if it has anything to do with the instructions that you're giving or the content, anything related to the content. Provide all information in writing if possible, as I mentioned earlier. Sharing copies of lecture notes and study guides, allowing more time for processing verbal requests and directions. Some students may need to express things in writing instead of verbally. So this happens sometimes, like in public speaking classes, maybe a student has selective mutism in addition to their autism, and so it makes it very hard for them to speak in front of anyone, even if it's just one person, like the instructor. I've had students that have used like text-to-speech apps. So if they have selective mutism, that usually means their vocal cords are working and they physically can speak, but it's more of a mental block that they can't speak. So they might be able to sometimes around people they're comfortable with, a lot of times close family members, but around people that they're not as familiar with, it's just not going to happen. Not because they don't want it to, but it's that mental block is just not going to let them say a word to anyone. Utilizing schedules and calendars, also very, very helpful. Anytime you can give advance notice of changes is fantastic. For folks on the spectrum, knowing what's coming is very helpful. It helps decrease some of that anxiety. It makes it a little easier for them to process what's important instead of being worried about what's going to happen next. What are we doing after this? Those kind of things. So some of the accommodations you might see, again, just because you see these accommodations doesn't mean that the person has autism. They could have these accommodations for a number of different reasons, but these are just some examples that I might give to someone who is on the spectrum. So getting copies of notes, rubrics with clear and concise instructions, course schedules with specific due dates. So a course outline, even if it's not the exact day that you're having a test, even if it's a weekly, week 1, we're going to do chapters 1 and 2. Week 2, we're going to do 3 and 4. If you can give them an idea of how many tests and quizzes will be required each week, that's helpful too, just so they have a general idea at least of what's coming and how much time they need to set aside to study and prepare for things. Giving examples of work expectations is really helpful too. Giving step-by-step instructions. So we might assume that they know what to do if we give simple instructions. There might be a lot that we just inherently know and assume that our students are going to inherently know. And that person on the spectrum may know that. But if you don't say, this is what I want you to do, even if they know that it was probably assumed, they might skip that step because it wasn't in the instructions. They're going to take it very literally and just move right along. And that could cause a lot of unnecessary issues. So when you're typing out instructions or writing out instructions, try to make them as detailed as possible. Even if it feels a little bit like overkill, it's really, really, really helpful. And it'll save a lot of heartache for everyone. Giving advance notice of course changes, schedules, due dates, very helpful. Low distraction test environment, extra time for testing, being able to use a computer for writing assignments, using headphones or earbuds when they're working on independent work. So this is only when they're working on independent assignments. They're not allowed to do this when the instructor is actually lecturing or they're having a class discussion. And I tell all my students, if you're listening to music, make sure it's at a volume that's not disturbing everyone else, that kind of stuff. And being allowed to step out of class briefly. So sometimes folks on the spectrum will get really overwhelmed and they just need a minute. So being able to walk out of class and not be penalized for it is helpful. Now I tell them this doesn't mean you get to leave for 30 minutes and come back every single class. And whatever you miss, it's your responsibility to follow up with your instructor and find out what you missed. They're not going to automatically do it for you because you're an adult and this is college. But just being able to even make a lap around the building and come back and just kind of collect themselves so they don't get too overwhelmed to the point where they're not absorbing anything in the lecture. So these are a couple things that you can do to make your learning environment a bit more inclusive. This is going to sound pretty repetitive because it's very similar to a lot of the strategies and accommodations that I just mentioned. So again, providing those written instructions, super, super helpful. Again, not just for folks on the spectrum, but I think it's helpful for anyone in your class, regardless of their disability status. If possible, on the first day of class, providing a course schedule with specific due dates, the more specific, the better. I understand that, things happen and you may not know exactly what you're going to do on each class day because you may, depending on the class, have to shift things around. It all depends on the students. But even just a general course outline is really helpful. Giving advance notice of course changes, schedules, due dates, giving examples of work expectations, allowing students to have fidget or sensory objects, wearing headphones or earplugs, again, as long as these things don't disrupt the rest of the class. So I had a student once ask if he could bring his modeling clay as his sensory fidget toy. And he was literally going to be building models out of clay on his desk. So no, we told him no on that one because obviously that'd be pretty distracting to folks around him if they're trying to take notes and he's over there just building a little, I don't even know what he was building. But it has to be reasonable. So if it's loud, if it's distracting, that's not reasonable. Setting milestones prior to deadlines is also helpful. Students on the spectrum have a hard time asking for help or asking for feedback. A lot of times they just won't think to ask for feedback. So it's helpful if you have those milestones that kind of force them to check in with you and make sure they're on the right track and not completely, off course. Scaffolding is really helpful. having a routine in your class. So if they know that every day when they come in, the first thing they're going to do is a vocabulary quiz, and then you're going to review what you talked about last time, and then the instructor is going to lecture, and then you're going to do independent work, whatever it is. It's helpful for them to feel like they know what to expect, even if the content is different, of course. Using direct language, avoiding irony and sarcasm. Also redirecting inappropriate behavior. So if that student is interrupting, if they are doing anything that's distracting the rest of the class, be direct. I know in the South we have a tendency to want to sugarcoat things and not hurt anyone's feelings. We're not going to hurt their feelings. You just need to tell them exactly what they need to do or what they don't need to do. So if they are, this happens a lot sometimes in social situations. I had a student one time who was really adamant that this girl in his class was going to be his friend. And so he was calling, he was texting, he was emailing, he was trying to sit beside her all the time. And it kind of freaked her out. She was like, oh, okay. And, was trying to be nice about it. And then the instructor came to me and I said, you just have to be very brutally honest with that student and say, I'm sorry that you want to be friends with this student, but you're making them uncomfortable. So do not talk to them. Do not call them. Do not text them. Don't email them. Not from your personal email, not from your school email. They will take what you say very literally. I had another student who was told not to drive on campus. So he didn't drive onto campus, but he did rollerblade onto campus because we didn't say not to rollerblade on campus. And he wasn't trying to be, a smart aleck about it, but he just took it very literally. You said not to drive, but you didn't say anything about walking, running, rollerblading, skateboarding. So be direct. Don't be afraid to be straightforward. If that student just can't be redirected, they keep interrupting, they keep distracting the rest of the class, ask them to step out, collect themselves. Allowing students the choice to work independently or in groups. Obviously, with that difficulty with social interactions, it can be really hard for folks on the spectrum to work in groups. Sometimes it's helpful for them to kind of push their limits and work on that, but sometimes it's counterproductive. So, feel that out, see if you feel like it's appropriate to maybe let them work independently. Doing a flipped classroom is also very helpful. All right, any questions?
Not really. I think you're good. You just covered it all.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
It's very thorough. I mean, I wonder if
It
we
was.
could talk generally about just some like hypotheticals. Maybe we can like walk through a couple like scenario situations. Carolyn, would you be open to that?
Yes, let's do that. Perfect.
Dan, you're our well here. Can you think of a time where you had a student who maybe was exhibiting some of these behaviors and like maybe don't tell us what you did, but just what the student behavior looked like, and we can talk about ways of responding?
Well, very, very asocial. And I not necessarily say what I did, but ultimately I just kind of let him do what he wanted to do. He would sit in the back and just kind of, I think he was tuning in. He actually was doing pretty well in the class. It wasn't a big class. And like I said, he wasn't engaged. I would ask questions and he really had no interest in answering questions. It was open-ended questions to the class, not necessarily to him. And as far as, interacting with him, I pretty much would act and treat him like I did any other student, and it seemed to work out real well. So.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. You treated him like every other student. Yay. That is what I want all instructors to do, because they're in college. College is a choice. There is no accommodation I can give a student that exempts them from meeting the requirements of the class or abiding by the student code of conduct. Sometimes instructors think if a student has a disability, well, then I need to give them a little bit more slack, or I need to, maybe give them a few more chances with whatever the behavior is. No, you don't. They are expected to act like an adult when they're here, regardless of their disability. So that was a good one.
What about changes, right? We have a student who we suspect maybe on the autism spectrum, maybe we even know that they are, but based on the accommodation, we're not violating anything, but we've changed a due date. and the student becomes concerned and upset and vocalizes that to us either through an email or even maybe during a class session, that this isn't fair, that the due date shouldn't be changed.
Okay. So I think in those situations, it's helpful just to explain maybe why the due date was changed. And maybe let them know that, well, yeah, I guess it depends on how or when it was changed too, but that it's not like they're getting less time to do it, or maybe there's less work that they have to do if the due date was moved up. Just sort of explaining it to them that it's not a punishment. It's not because you're trying to make their lives difficult, but this is a situation. This is what had to happen. And if they want to talk to you about it more after class, happy to do that.
Yeah, even like in the moment, right? Like we were going to do this activity today, but we need to do something different, right? Like change can be really challenging for students on the spectrum. So suggestions for when we do have to make changes. Any other coaching that you can share with us? How we could talk about that with our class?
Again, I think the more information you can give them about why the change is happening is helpful. And just giving them some time to process it. So, not getting upset with them if they aren't immediately jumping into the new task, not getting frustrated if they ask, why is this change happening? Or, well, what about the assignment we were going to do? Because they may ask you several times about it. Just reassuring them that it's okay. This change is happening, but it's all going to be good. It's all going to work out. This is what we're doing today. You might have to reiterate to them that this is the new schedule. This is the new activity. And I would say just have some patience, have some grace with them, and give them a minute or 2 or 3 to adjust and process that change. Don't take it personally if they keep asking you about it.
Dan, I know you have some really great discussions in some of your classes where you open up things and students talk back and forth and share their opinions on a topic. Sometimes students on the autism spectrum have a hard time taking others' perspectives and have a hard time not being right. So let's say you've got a student who's just insisting that everybody else in the class is stupid and that they're the ones who are right. Okay,
Wow.
coach. Yeah, I mean, that's never happened, right, Dan? You've never had a student who's just bound and determined to be right.
No, not here anyway.
Well, that's good. I certainly have had that. to the point of like quite a lot of emotional dysregulation sometimes, even where they get like visually upset about a thing, right? So what's our go-to move there, Carolyn?
I think obviously trying to redirect them and letting them know that that kind of behavior is not appropriate. Like, it's fine if you disagree, but you need to be respectful about it. Everyone has to be respectful. You don't have to be their friend. You don't have to agree, but if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And if they keep at it, ask them to leave. If they're just going to keep being rude and can't let it go, then maybe they need to take a minute and step out. Maybe they need to leave for the day and then come back to the next class and hopefully have it together. That's what I would do. What would you do, Sarah?
I mean, a lot of times I do start with let's take a breath, right? Let's just take a minute, maybe take a few minutes away from the situation and kind of diffuse a little bit and get them re-regulated, because if a student gets to that point of being emotionally upset about something, it's going to be really hard to have rational conversation.
I wish I had more to offer here, more to ask. Sorry. The class you were referring to was last about a year ago. We had a very small class, 5 or 6 people, and it was very interactive. We actually got pretty close. And this one individual, he always stayed till the end, but when some of the other students would stay around for another 15 minutes or half an hour and social, he was gone. So, and that's fine. He can be where he needs to be, and that was fine. So I didn't experience any of the stuff you're talking about. It actually went rather smoothly.
Well, and I think the good news is if we have the right supports in place and they have an understanding of what's expected and we have accommodations that match the students' needs, then we shouldn't have those kinds of incidents. But it's also, I just really appreciate that Carolyn can share common characteristics, because we know that we have a lot of students who are not diagnosed or who may not, they just may not have awareness of their own behaviors, right?
They also have to disclose on their own when they get to college. So even if they had supports like an IEP or 504 in high school, they have to come here. Nothing automatically transfers. We don't identify students for those kind of services, or it's not our responsibility anyway. They have to disclose, and so sometimes they don't want to. Again, it's that social thing. They don't want to go talk to someone new. They don't want to have to go to a different building and talk to someone they've never met. And also the accommodations are different in college than they are in high school. So there may be some things, some extra supports they had in high school that we can't do here. So those social, emotional behavior classes that they had for students where they only worked on those social skills, obviously we don't have anything like that. Being able to go to a sensory room, we don't have sensory rooms. So it's a lot different. It's a lot of change for anyone, and especially being on the spectrum, it can just be a lot.
Yeah. Carolyn, it made me think about Dan's department in particular. We do have there's probably a lot of students who are online students, and we may never meet them in person, but they have a diagnosis or they exhibit behaviors that would lead to a diagnosis if they got tested, right? Can you talk about like what that might look like in terms of online behaviors?
Okay. I suppose it would depend on the class and the activities. So are you talking about an online class where there's not even like a Zoom meeting?
Yeah, probably not even a Zoom, like an asynchronous online class. I mean, I imagine there are some students on the spectrum who think that that's the way I should do school, right? Like that feels safe because I don't have to have the social interaction. Things are more structured and more clear. What might be challenging for a student on the spectrum in an online course?
Okay. So a lot of times what ends up being problematic is their understanding of instructions, because that self-advocacy piece is really tough. They're not necessarily going to ask questions. If they don't understand something, a lot of times if they don't understand something, they'll just skip it. They just won't do it. And so then an instructor assumes that they just don't care and they don't want to be in the class, and they'll get withdrawn or they'll get dropped. And when really, if they had just reached out and said, hey, I was having technical difficulties or I didn't understand the assignment, it could have easily been remedied. But that not reaching out, sometimes if there's a discussion board type activity, that can be tricky. Interacting appropriately and responding appropriately to other students and the instructor. Even just their written communication sometimes might come off a little abrupt or a little rude, even if they don't mean to. I think that's hard for everybody via email. I know it is for me. I have to reread all of my emails and insert smiley faces to make sure I'm not coming off as just being a jerk and telling people what to do. So that's what I've seen the most.
Right, because being direct and logical makes a lot of sense to somebody on the autism spectrum generally, right?
Yeah, they're not thinking about being rude. They're not thinking about your feelings and how you're going to interpret that. They're just thinking, I'm responding to this email. This was the answer to your question. It didn't need more than 3 words, so I'm not going to fluff it up with, hi, I'm great. How are you? Hope you had a great weekend. Yeah, this is what I thought about the nope, they're just going to give you a straight answer. So yeah, not taking that personally. They're not trying to be mean.
I think this could be helpful for a couple of my adjuncts. When you mentioned online, I had completely forgotten that I had an online student who, again, there was no accommodation for them. But I actually had an opportunity to meet him personally. He came in with a parent, and in any case, the behavior was that he was writing these long, involved emails to the instructor complaining about everything. And the instructor was just kind of taken aback. I don't think he suspected anything. I kind of figured it out when I actually got a chance to meet him face to face. It's pretty easy because he's kind of no eye contact, kind of fidgeting around and some strange body language. And very intelligent. I mean, anyone that I've ever met on the spectrum has usually not been in any way compromised in that regard. They're usually way smart. But yeah, it's helped that I sort of was able to identify that and give the instructors kind of a heads up of, maybe somewhat instinctively some of the stuff that you're talking about to kind of, thwart it and not cause a problem. And when I knew the student was going to be in another of my adjuncts classes, I kind of talked to him at the beginning of the semester and gave him a heads up on that. So I think a lot of what you just mentioned makes a lot of sense. So the clear directions, that seemed to be a lot of what they were complaining about, is, I didn't like the way the class was happening, and, it wasn't being taught properly, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can, clear up all those misconceptions, like, this is what you need to do and this is how it's going to be done, and I think it would work out a lot better. So
Sometimes, yeah, you just have to say, well, this is how it is. This is my class, and this is how it's structured. If you want to go on and become an adjunct IT instructor, you can run your class how you want to run it. But that's a good one. Yeah.
And Carolyn, what happened, what it sounds like happened for Dan was that he got a good understanding of maybe what was happening for that student, but he said the student didn't have accommodations, right? So this student is unknown to you, or your office. And so in that moment, does Dan have an opportunity to say anything to the student? Should Dan start that conversation like, hey, are you using any support services here at the college? Like, do we have that conversation with the student or not? What are your thoughts?
good question.
I think it depends on the student and what preceded this conversation. Are they saying I'm struggling, or are they just complaining? Have you noticed their grades slipping? It's helpful if you can point to something objective, like, I've noticed you haven't been turning in assignments, or you were turning in assignments and now you've all of a sudden stopped, or you've had a hard time finishing time tests on time. I've noticed the last couple of questions are always blank. Anytime you can point to something like that and say, well, have you looked into support services? Have you contacted student services? We never want to assume that someone has a disability and say, oh, you need to talk to accessibility services. You're probably on the spectrum, or you're probably this or that, which I'm sure we never want to say to a student. But encourage them to use the supports are there. You can tell them that they can just talk to me about it, and even if I'm not the department for them, that I can still refer them to someone else who might be able to help. So just because they're coming to see me doesn't mean you think they have a disability, even if you are pretty sure they do. But you can word it so that you're just saying, hey, go talk to this person. She can help link you with the supports you might need. And then I can ask them all the nitty-gritty awkward questions.
And we can also do that through Watermark, correct? We could do a disability service. It's still called disability services referral.
It should be student accessibility services now.
Okay, great. So in Watermark, that's one of the drop-down alerts, and that will go directly to Carolyn, and the student will not see it.
Correct. Yes. And usually I will reach out and ask if it's okay that I share with the student that the whatever instructor was the one that referred them, or just see how much information you want me to share or not share. I could be as vague or as detailed as you're comfortable with me being.
Now, on the other side, what Dan said, and this is, I really appreciate, Dan, your story here, because it's real, right? This really happens.
Yeah.
You gave a heads up to another instructor in the, next semester saying, hey, you've got this student in your class. This is where we got to be careful though, right, Carolyn? We can't say to that instructor, we can't say the student's on the spectrum. We cannot say that, right? What can we, like, we can tell what happened in that instance, right? Like Dan's okay to say something like, I just want to share with you an incident that occurred last semester.
Yeah,
Is that
the student
appropriate?
has a habit of doing this one specific thing, like you said, sending those really long emails complaining about how the class was being taught. I mean, that's perfectly okay. You would do that for any other student, regardless of their disability. If you had a student that consistently did something like that, yeah, you want to give people a heads up. I hope most people would want to do that. But yeah, as long as we're not making assumptions and then telling other people about these assumptions. So yeah, pointing to a specific behavior that you observed or that the other instructor observed, and just keeping it at that.
So focus on behavior, not diagnosis.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's not going to do us much good anyway, because
Right.
we're not health professionals and we're not going to be treating them even if we could diagnose them.
Right.
And a lot of times the folks on the spectrum, your example was really good, Dan. There's not really any accommodations I could give for that student, even though they probably should be registered with my office and they probably could use some supports. For that particular behavior, there's not really an accommodation for that. They need to be respectful just like everyone else. And if they're being disrespectful, they need to be told to stop doing that. And if they don't stop, then would take whatever steps you would take with any other student. So don't feel like you have to treat them any kind of special way. If you set the bar high, they'll succeed. And if not, maybe college isn't a good fit for them right now. Some students just, it's too much, and that's fine. We don't have to guarantee that they'll be successful, and if maybe it doesn't work out this semester, maybe they take some time off, come back and do a lot better. But we don't want to give them accommodations or try to make things easier for them, because in the long run, we just set them up for failure, because real life is not going to be that accommodating or kind. So better that they learn that here with folks who are going to be more understanding, and the consequences aren't as severe as, let's say, losing a job or criminal charges, worst case, you know. Failing a class is not so bad in compared to other things.
I think about like class discussion probably more, but also like even in a discussion forum, right? Like if a student is engaging and maybe again insisting on their position or writing these long posts, maybe coming off as rude, an instructor may get feedback from the other students, right? May get an email saying that the student is being really rude to everybody, or I don't really like this person reading my post because they always say something like X or whatever. In my experience in those kinds of moments, I think that can be really tricky, because again, we're holding them to a standard that we know might be, especially if they have an accommodation and we have some insight on what that's about. I think it can be really hard to expect a behavior that's really challenging for that student. But some coaching, like just saying like, these are some things that may come off as rude. These are ways, like just being a little bit more, like you said, direct about this is not okay in a private communication with a student. Is that like,
Yes.
What else would you recommend?
Yeah, especially if it's upsetting other students. I would always go back to, whatever kind of student conduct statement you have in your syllabus, remind them of that, because every student has to abide by that no matter what. Give them examples of what's not appropriate, because just saying, hey, your post the other week was, or came off as rude and some students were upset. Highlight that post, maybe send it back to them, highlight in there exactly what was upsetting and what was not appropriate, so that they know what not to do. So that giving examples of expectations is very helpful. The more specific you can be, the better. Again, with just what's right in front of you. We're not making assumptions about their behavior outside of this class or anything else, just what we have observed and what we can see and point to. That makes sense, kind of.
Dan, anything else come to mind for you and learning more about this?
No, unfortunately, no. I wish I had something else to offer. We have a lot of our students are online, so I bet that there's a lot of students that are out there that are, they're not listed under an accommodation. So,
and that population, or this population specifically, is probably one of the few that I work with that does well online. Most students that are registered with my office online is not. It just doesn't work for them. But students on the spectrum tend to do very well online for pretty obvious reasons.
yeah, that's good.
And yeah, you may never know that they're on the spectrum.
Yeah, unless they come into my office and complain.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've already learned about Carolyn is that she's very available and really interested and willing to support our faculty. And so it's great that we've got such a skilled resource here with our accessibility services office and our coordinator, Carolyn. I just want to thank you for being with us today on the call. And again, I know that you're always really happy to answer questions. I've heard you say before, there's no dumb questions. We can ask you anything, and you're going to guide us and give us the next steps that we can take to support our students.
Yes, definitely. I don't ever want instructors to feel like there's something they can't ask me, or be afraid that they might say something that's not appropriate or not okay. You can say whatever you want to me, not to the students, but to me, you can say whatever you want, and we can talk about it. And use me as a safety net. If there's ever a situation that you feel kind of sketchy about, or you feel like this student is kind of hinting at, well, I'm going to file a complaint or a grievance, get me involved, because then you can just cover your butt and say, well, she told me to do it. So yeah.
Very helpful, Carolyn. Appreciate it.
Yes,
You-
thank you guys so much. I
Yeah.
have some resources on here too if
Yeah.
folks want some more in-depth information. But I'm always here.
And Dan, I'll send you a PDF of this slide deck so that you can get to all the links that she's got.
That'd be great. I may share that with some adjuncts,
Good.
have some conversations with them a little bit.
Yeah. Awesome.
And if there's ever a situation with a student that faculty just want to talk through, I'm happy to do that too, even if they're not registered with my office. If there's some kind of behavior issue that just seems kind of out of the norm, maybe something that keeps happening over and over again, and the student's been redirected but it's not working, I'm happy to talk through that stuff. And I'm good at keeping it to myself.
Great.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Carolyn, for being here with us today. And Dan, thanks for joining us on the call. Hope you all have a great afternoon. It's almost Friday. All right. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Guys, I appreciate it.